Application of Brown versus Board of Education was very slow in happening. It was done with, quote, all deliberate speed. And even in cases where it was done, there was resistance beginning almost immediately. Many Southern schools simply ignored the orders to desegregate. Others chose to close their doors rather than integrate and have black students and white students together. The photograph there is some student protesters at Clinton High School in Clinton, Tennessee in 1956. In February 1956, that protest was spreading into the halls of Congress. And in fact, a vast majority of representatives, senators, and representatives from the former Confederate states got together and drew up a document of protest over Brown versus Board of Education that is called the Southern Manifesto. The first draft of it was written by none other than Strom Thurmond, who was the Dixiecrat candidate for president. Remember, back in 1948, the Southern Democratic Party, the Dixiecrats, whose sole purpose was to protect segregation. And here's some of the things they had to say. We regard the decisions of the Supreme Court in the school cases as a clear abuse of judicial power. It climaxes a trend in the federal judiciary undertaking to legislate in derogation of the authority of Congress and to encroach upon the reserved rights of the states and the people. Then they go on to talk about Plessy versus Ferguson and the fact that separate but equal was protected by the court at that time. And they say, quote, this interpretation, restated time and again, became a part of the life of the people of many of the states and confirmed their habits, traditions, and way of life. It is founded on elemental humanity and common sense. And then they go on to say, this unwarranted exercise of power by the court, contrary to the Constitution, is creating chaos and confusion in the states principally affected. It is destroying the amicable relations between the white and Negro races that have been created through 90 years of patient effort by the good people of both races. It has planted hatred and suspicion where there has been heretofore friendship and understanding. And they conclude, we pledge ourselves to use all lawful means to bring about a reversal of this decision, which is contrary to the Constitution, and to prevent the use of force in its implementation. In this trying period, as we all seek to right this wrong, we appeal to our people not to be provoked by the agitators and troublemakers invading our states, and to scrupulously refrain from disorder and lawless acts. The Confederacy had had 11 states. That means that in 1956 there were 22 senators from former Confederate states in the South. There were also 110 representatives from those former Confederate states. So, out of that number, 19 of the 22 senators signed on to this Southern Manifesto. Also, out of that number, 82 out of the 110 representatives signed on to the manifesto. That means there were 3 senators who did not, and that means that there were 28 representatives who did not. Now, among those congressmen from the 11 former Confederate states, there was not one single Republican senator. However, there were 6 Republican representatives out of a total of 110. Out of those 6 Republican representatives, 2 signed it, the 2 from Virginia, and then 4 did not. That was 1 from Florida, 1 from North Carolina, and 2 from Tennessee, one of whom was Howard Baker Sr. who would later be a senator. In fact, in Tennessee, out of 9 representatives, 4 signed it and 5 refused to sign it. So out of those 5, 2 were Republicans and 3 were Democrats, and that included Percy Priest and Joel Evans, that are familiar names still in Tennessee. Now, nobody who was in the Senate or the House signed on from those states that had not been Confederate but had been slaveholding states. That includes Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri. So none of them signed on. But out of the former Confederacy, the vast majority, in fact, did. Now, I've always taken it as a point of pride that both of Tennessee's senators, Al Gore Sr. and Estes Kefauver, were among the 3 Southern senators who refused to sign on to this thing. So I'm not even going to make fun of Estes Kefauver's coonskin cap during this slide. The third one was Lyndon Johnson from Texas, that we'll be hearing a lot more about, and that as you learn more about him, you will not be surprised that he was not a signatory to the Southern Manifesto. In the midst of all this opposition to desegregation in the South, in the former Confederate states, the Confederate flag became a very prominent piece of imagery in all those protests. And not coincidentally, the Confederate flag started showing up in public again. Now, the Mississippi state flag had the Confederate flag incorporated into it way back, I think, in the 1890s. Mississippi was ahead of the curve or behind the curve, depending on how you look at it, way ahead of everybody else. But for the other states, the other areas where the Confederate flag was either adopted into existing flags or flown on its own over government buildings, this all started in the 1950s. Kind of a little bit ahead of the curve of the others. In Shreveport, Louisiana, the Confederate flag was raised over the courthouse in that year. But after 1955-56, all of a sudden, you started seeing a lot more Confederate flags. Georgia added the Confederate flag to their state flag in 1956, and it would be there for almost a half a century. But it wasn't there before 1956. The Confederate flags, battle flags, were flown over capitals in South Carolina and in Alabama, and they went up around 1960, or at least by 60 or 61. Gee, I wonder what the connection is. Well, the connection is that this flag was being used as a symbol for the Confederate South and a symbol for segregation and protecting segregation. Meanwhile, schools in the South continued to resist integration. In 1956, the University of Alabama was forced to admit the young African-American student Arthurine Lucy, shown here with Roy Wilkins on the left, who was the executive secretary of the NAACP, and on the right is her lawyer, the NAACP lawyer, Thurgood Marshall. Just a few months after they were forced to admit her, they expelled her. Why? Well, because she had sued the university, and so therefore that's slandering the university, and why we can't let people like that be students. In 1957, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus, no doubt still incensed that his parents had named him Orville Faubus, not only protested the court order that the Little Rock High School had to allow 9 African American students to join their student body. He not only protested that, he sent the National Guard to prevent them from entering the school. And it didn't didn't hurt his cause that there was also a huge, angry mob of white people um, carrying signs. For example, there's one there that says, race mixing is communism, that were there to keep these kids from going to school. The National Guard. How do you top that? Well, President Eisenhower topped that. He sent in the 101st Airborne to escort them to school. And so they did. Armed escort, taking them to class and then back from class, all the while as an angry mob of racist white people followed close around them, yelling obscenities and threats. So then, all deliberate speed, which I keep coming back to, for a reason, what that essentially meant was that by the beginning of the 1960s, 6 years after Brown v. Board had essentially said that schools have to be desegregated, only 2% of African American children in the South were attending integrated schools. 2%. There was clearly a long way to go.